So I want to welcome everybody to our study in the book of Daniel. Tonight we're going to pick up where we left off last week. We left off at Daniel chapter 1, verse 8. So we're going to pick up in verse 8 right there again tonight. But let me just kind of give you a real quick overview so we're all on the same page and we're all kind of keeping in mind what's going on. Daniel is the writer of this book, and he's the main character of the book. We're going to see he and three of his friends, their life chronicled in this book. These guys were Jews who were taken into exile, taken captive by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. They were taken from their homeland in Jerusalem, the southern kingdom, and they were taken back to Babylon, where as a young teenagers, most believe that these guys are somewhere around the age of 15 when Nebuchadnezzar comes and conquers the southern kingdom and hauls them back to Babylon. So they're somewhere around the age 15, 16 years old. They're young teenagers. And Nebuchadnezzar takes them back to Babylon, and he puts them into a 3-year training program where he's going to isolate them from everything that they've grown up with, family included. He's going to change the way they think. He's going to change the way they eat. He's going to try to change their names. He's going to try to change their faith and their religion. And he's just going to try to indoctrinate them into the Babylonian ways. These young men who were taken, don't forget, these young men who were taken from the southern kingdom of Jerusalem, there in Judea, they were the best and the brightest. They were from nobility. These were young men who have bright futures, and they're teachable and they're moldable, and they're taken for that reason so that they can be indoctrinated into the Babylonian way. So what we saw last week is that once he got them there, he gave those young men over to his chief eunuch after the study the other day. So we'll just go ahead and make sure everybody's on the same page here. It keeps saying the chief eunuch. What is that? Well, these ancient monarchs would have men that would be entrusted into their service, and what they would do is they would castrate these men so that they were totally devoted to the king. And they did that also because these men who are working in the king's kingdom, so to speak, there was no way that they could ever be attracted to the queen or any of their children or anything such as that. So very cruel, very harsh, but that's what the eunuch is, somebody that the king is going to trust in that way. So that's what's going on there. The eunuch, the chief eunuch takes them and he tells them, okay, here's your new name. We saw last week that the name Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, each one of those names have something to do with God, the God of heaven. And they were all given new names. Daniel was given the name Belshazzar, and then the three names that we're familiar with, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And each of those names, we won't go all the way into it, but they had to do with Babylonian gods. So he's trying to change their identity even with their namesake. He tells them that they're now going to eat from the king's table. And that sounds like a pretty good deal, especially if you're a 15-year-old and you have been exiled. You're not around mom, you're not around grandma, you're not around anybody that used to cook for you. And now you're in a new and a far-off land, and they're going to be given food from the king's table. Where we're going to pick up today is where Daniel takes issues with that. He's going to say, I can't eat from the king's table. And what we're going to see today as we get into this study, let me just kind of lay it out for you, and then we'll get into the particular passages. We're going to see that Daniel, when he takes a stand, and we're going to see him take a stand several times through this book. And there's times in our life that it required that we take a stand. There's things that are going on in Daniel's life that he doesn't take a stand on. He's given a new name, and he doesn't worry about that. He doesn't argue about that. And I think what that comes down to was he was a young man who was, even though he was as young as he was like, I know who I am. You can call me what you want to call me, but I know who I am. He didn't say anything about the new education program that they were getting ready to be indoctrinated into. And I think, again, even at the young age of 15, he was strong enough that he was like, I know not only who I am, but I know what it is that I believe. So I can be faced with this indoctrination, yet I still know who my God is. I still know what He stands for. I still know what He's done for me and my people throughout the history of us. He knew His history. He knew from where He came. So He didn't say anything about those things, but when it came to the king's food, He said, I can't. And the point that I think we need to see in that is that the fact is, how He handles this is amazing. He doesn't go on a strike. He doesn't go on a protest. He just simply says, can we work out a deal here? And we'll see that as we get into the study. So I think that's amazing, and I think that's showing us a lot about who Daniel was. So with that, let's go ahead and pick up in Daniel chapter 1. Let's start in verse 8. We left off there last week, and verse 8 says, But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. That word resolve right there is a profound word. That's a word that just simply means he made up his mind. It means that he was, the New Living Translation says it this way, he was determined. The New King James Version says it this way, he purposed in his heart. We studied not long ago upstairs, we studied Romans chapter 12, 1 and 2. And in Romans chapter 12, 1 and 2, specifically verse 2, we saw that Paul taught in verse 2 of Romans that he says, don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And what we said about not being conformed, conform is pressure from the outside. And can you see, as a 15-year-old who's been hauled, 800 miles from his hometown and put into a new place with the food, the new name, the new education, I'm sure new clothes, the whole 9 yards, can you see how the pressure from the outside would have been trying to conform him? That's exactly what Nebuchadnezzar wanted to do. Romans 12:2 says, don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. When Daniel resolved himself, decided in his mind he wasn't going to do this, that means that he had a transformed mind. He knew what it was that he was standing for. He knew he wasn't going to do certain things, and that's what this passage is telling us. Proverbs chapter 4, verse 23. You don't have to turn there, but the New Living Translation of Proverbs 4:23 says this. It says, guard your heart above all else, for it determines the course of your life. And that's what Daniel is doing right here. There's hills to die on and there's hills not to die on. The name, the education, he didn't see those as hills to die on. But when it came to the food, he drew a line in the sand. And we're going to talk more about why he drew that line in the sand here in just a second. It goes on there in the rest of verse 8. It says, therefore, because he was resolved, therefore, he asked the chief of the eunuchs. Now that was Ashpenaz. That was Ashpenaz. We met him early. To allow him not to defile himself. Daniel saw that the food that he was going to eat was going to defile him. That word defile it's a harsh word. And it means that this is going against something that I am standing on. This is going against who I am. Now the truth of the matter is, we don't really know why he thought the food was going to defile him. Here's some logical reasons why it probably is one of these or a combination of these. But we're not exactly sure 100%. Perhaps it was dietary. And what I mean by that is maybe he saw it as uncleaned, non-kosher food. And Daniel was a Jew. So we can go all the way back to Leviticus 11. And in Leviticus 11, in that chapter, it talks about the dietary plan for a Jewish person. And it says that there are certain foods that are clean, there are certain foods that are unclean. Not only are there certain foods that are unclean, but even clean foods, allowable foods, if they're not prepared in the proper way. Leviticus is all about the rules of the Jewish people. And even if it's not prepared in the proper way, it can be deemed unclean. So perhaps he saw the food that the king was going to share was non-kosher, and it was a violation of his dietary laws. Perhaps it was a spiritual or religious reason. And we see in Deuteronomy chapter 6 that food, and this is amazing how God does this. There's no way that I could think this far ahead and put these things together. But if you were here Sunday when we were studying in Romans chapter 14 and 15, we saw it had to deal with food and the kinds of food that we eat and things such as that. And we came to the realization that this could be a religious or spiritual reason that he was rejecting it. And that would be that perhaps the food that he was being offered was food that was sacrificed to idols. Just real quickly, if you'll remember from Sunday, what we said was that people didn't have refrigerators and freezers. So if they had an animal and they slaughtered that animal to eat, they had to give that animal away or eat it all at one time. There was no putting it in the freezer and saving it for later. There was no putting it in the icebox and saving it for tomorrow. So meat eating was something that they didn't get to do a whole lot. The people who ran meat markets in that day, what they would do is they would go around in the town that they lived in to the temples of the false gods that were everywhere, because people were worshiping all these false gods everywhere, and they would find the sacrificial systems that went on inside those temples of false gods, and they would buy the meat that had been used in religious rituals in those temples. And they would bring it back to the market, they would put it out for sale, and that's where people would oftentimes pick up their meat. So perhaps he saw it was a defilement for religious purposes. Maybe it was symbolic. We know that in this time and in the Eastern culture, that when you would eat at a table with somebody, it was you showing friendship to that person. You showing camaraderie with that person. So maybe it was for that reason. And it may have been a combination of all those reasons. We don't know, because the Bible doesn't just specifically say this is it. So for one of those reasons or all of those reasons, whatever it was, Daniel had resolved in his heart not to do it. Now, one other thing I'll say real quick. And the scriptures talk about eating from the king's table in several different places. And that doesn't necessarily mean, and I painted that picture, and that's the reason I want to say this. I kind of painted the picture of, Daniel sitting down and the king sitting right there at the table, with him and eating. And that's not necessarily what it was talking about as far as sitting at the same table. It meant that you had some of the king's allotment, the same food that was allowed for the king. The kings have an extra prepared in the kitchen, and now you have some of that food as well. They probably weren't sitting down, at the same physical table as Nebuchadnezzar, especially early on in the training. I'm sure that they weren't. But so Daniel's objecting for some of these reasons, all of these reasons. We don't really know why, but we do know that he resolved in his heart not to do it. Now, what we see in verse 9 is that God gave Daniel favor. Verse 9 says, God gave Daniel favor and compassion, maybe your Bible says goodwill, in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you were in worse condition than the youths who are with you at your own age? So this would endanger my head with the king, is what the eunuch said to him. Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days, and let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. And then let our appearance be judged at that point. So let's talk about that right there. The first thing that I want you to see is we can't move past the fact in verse 9, it says God gave. We're going to see that God gave 3 different times right here at the start of the book of Daniel. The first one we already saw. It was back in the start of chapter 1 where it said God gave the Israelites, even the king, Jehoiakim, over into the hands of the Babylonians. We talked about that last week. We made a big deal of that. It wasn't the Babylonians' might that came in and conquered the Israelites, the Jews here. It was God giving them over. Why? Because of their false worship and the wrong things that they were doing. Here it says that God gave favor in the eyes of the eunuch. So the eunuch is listening, Ashpenaz is listening to Daniel when he says, hey, I can't eat this. He gives him favor. He shows him compassion. When you hear the word favor, God's favor, let me throw this at you real quick. When you hear the word favor, what comes to your mind? God's favor is upon you.
Being kind.
Being kind, okay. God showing His grace. Anybody else?
Approval.
Say again? Approval, okay. I think it's even more than approval. It's, I approve and bless, okay. I wrote this down. It means favor is God's loyal love. It's God's faithfulness to a relationship. And I want this to stay. I want you to see this. God's favor is God's love towards you. It's His faithfulness in a relationship. When the rain falls, it's God's favor. When the sun comes up, it's God's favor. When we sit down in a home that's cool in the summer, that's God's favor. When we sit down in a home that's warm in the winter, that's God's favor. When we have plenty in the fridge to eat, that's God's favor. When we've got clothes to wear, that's God's. I want you to see that this is God reacting in a loving way in the relationships that He has with people. There's times that He shows extra favor, but that's God's loyal love. It's His faithfulness to a relationship. I even wrote it down this way. It's God devoted in not only love, but also deeds of mercy to benefit man. Favor is tied to God's character. It's His unmerited kindness. So you get an idea of what that is, and that's what God shows Daniel and his 3 friends with Ashpenaz. It says also He showed them compassion, or maybe goodwill, and that just is another way of saying that He shows them deep love. I think it's incredibly wise how this young man, and I want you to keep going back to the fact that he's 15 years old, okay? He's 15 years old, and here he is standing up to the chief of the eunuchs who's saying, here's your new name, Belshazzar. Here's the education program you're going into, and here's the king's table. And he says, I just can't do this. Would you let us not eat the food? Did you see what Ashpenaz said? Ashpenaz says, I fear the king. I fear the king. There's no room in the heart of man for fear and faith both. I want you to hear that. That's a good little catchphrase that we need to let rest in our heart and our mind. There's not room in the human heart for both fear and faith. So, in other words, if your heart is ruled by fear, faith is little. If your heart is ruled by faith, fear has little impact. God gives you a brain so we use it, and we don't just go headlong into trouble. But we don't have to be dictated by fear. Ashpenaz is dictated by fear. Rightly so. Did you see what he said? If I give you guys a different diet, and the king looks up and he knows that he's given you guys into my control, and he sees your peers. Don't forget, it's not just Daniel and his three friends. There's a large group of kids that have been taken from the southern kingdom. So they've got friends that are there. There's a lot of them. We just see here in the book, in the book of Daniel, we just see the four of them talked about. He says, but if these other guys are looking healthy and they're looking good, and the king sees you guys are getting gant and not, looking like they are, it's my head. So Ashpenaz basically is saying, I can't do this. The steward that Ashpenaz put over the four of them specifically, and we don't even know who he is, but he goes to the steward. Daniel goes to the steward and says, hey, I know what Ashpenaz said, but can we work out a deal here? Can we work out a deal where you just feed us vegetables and water? Now, that word vegetable in the Hebrew, it carries the idea that it's anything that's planted by a seed. So this would be a vegetarian diet, is what this would be. This isn't just broccoli and cauliflower, and this would be a vegetable diet. This would be breads and grains and nuts and anything that grows from a seed. Basically, is what this would be. He says, "Would you give that diet to us?" And God continues to show favor even through the steward. And Daniel says, Let's test this for 10 days. Now, 10 days is really insignificant because how long is the program that they're in? It's 3 years. So he says, just 10 days. Give us 10 days on this diet. And let's see what happens. At the end of the 10 days, just check us. Do you see the wisdom in Daniel and how he's handling this? Do you see how Daniel is wise beyond his years as he goes and he works out these deals? That's basically going to be a win-win for everybody. It says in verse 13, he says, then let our appearance and the appearance of the youth who eat the king's food be observed by you. Daniel's talking to the steward. And deal with your servants according to what you see. Here's what Daniel has done, and I think this is key. Daniel, now, when I say this, I hope there's something that goes off in your head that says that doesn't quite sound right. Okay? So I'm kind of prompting you. Okay? That's the way you need to be thinking here when I say this. Daniel put God to the test right here. Now, I hope that maybe what you went was like, wait a minute. We're not supposed to put God to the test, right? And we're not supposed to put God to the test. But Daniel put God to the test here in a way where Daniel was being obedient to God, and he trusted God to be faithful in the promises that he had made. I'll take care of you, is what God says to his family, to his children. So he is testing the faithfulness of God. Not that God needs tested, but he's stepping out boldly and he's saying, I trust my God so much, I know that he can do this. Does that make sense? That's what he's doing. Now let me see. I wrote that down, and it probably sounds better the way I wrote that down. It says in verse 12 there where he's saying, test your servants for 10 days. That's where I'm saying he basically was putting God. This test was really putting God to the test. Daniel believed and he trusted God to honor their convictions and their commitments. Their convictions and their commitments came from their obedience to God. And because they grew up in His Word, they grew up in His ways, so they knew that God was going to be faithful here. Daniel didn't wrongly test God here. Daniel knew that as long as he was obeying God, God would be God and keep His promises right here. So that's what's going on when he says, test us in this. Well, let's see how this works out. Verse 14. So he, the steward, he listened. God granted favor again in this matter. And he tested them for 10 days. 10 days, a specific amount of time. All right? A precise amount of time right there. At the end of the 10 days, it was seen that they, Daniel and his three friends, were better in appearance and they were fatter in flesh. And that word fatter in the flesh, that just simply means that they were, some translations use the word ruddy, or they were robust. They looked healthy. They looked strong. All right? And that's what it's saying. They're looking good. And that more than any of the youths that ate the king's food. Verse 16, so the steward took away their food and the wine that they were to drink, and he gave them vegetables. So they passed the test. God was faithful. God did what he said he was going to do. And now they're on a 3-year program of a vegetarian diet is basically where they're going with this. But God gives them everything it is that they need. So we see God blessing them in incredible ways right here. We get into verse 17. As for the 4 youth, okay, not only did we got past the eating right here. Now let's see how God continues to bless them. As for the 4 youth, God gave. All right, so if you're keeping count, God gave 3 different times in this one chapter. He gave them over to Nebuchadnezzar. He gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief eunuch, Ashpenaz. And here it says, as for the 4 youth, Daniel and his 3 friends, God gave them learning and skills in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in visions and dreams. What's the difference in visions and dreams? Dreams happen at night when you're asleep. Visions happen in the day while you're awake. All right? We're going to see 6 different visions and dreams that we're going to deal with in the book of Daniel. And we're going to see that Daniel's gift, favor that God has given him, the blessings that God has given him, is going to be key in this study of the book of Daniel, where there's 6 different visions or dreams that are dealt with. Next week we get into the first one, and I'm telling you, you got to be here next week to see this, because as you studied through Revelation and you see this vision, there's so many things that are going to tie together. Now, even if I know you guys weren't able to be in the Revelation study, if you weren't in the Revelation study, it's still going to be incredible, because the book of Daniel here is going to tell us what God's plan, what God's program is for the world. And we're going to see that next week. So I'm just so excited I wanted to jump ahead to that this week, but we're going to get there next week. So, but you see that God gives them blessings. They can learn. They have the skills in the literature, in the wisdom, the Babylonian ways. Daniel's understanding the visions and the dreams. And then look, verse 18. Verse 18, what happens right here is we jump 3 years in the narrative here. We jump ahead 3 years, because now they're finished with their program. They're finished with their studies. They're finished with the intense study and the indoctrination. At the end, verse 18, at the end of the time when the king had commanded them that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuch, Ashpenaz, he brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them. And among all of them, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. Your Bible may say, therefore they entered into the king's personal service. That's what's going on right here. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians, the enchanters that were in all of his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the 1st year of King Cyrus. Now we'll get to that in just a moment. That's a timeline. That's going to tell us a whole lot of stuff here in a minute when I get to King Cyrus. But let's look at this, what's going on right here. God gives them favor. He shows them favor in the way that they learn. Gives Daniel the supernatural ability to interpret dreams and visions. At the end of the time, the king they come before the king, each one of them, and the king interviews them, talks to them, looks them over, and the king finds Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah 10 times better than any of the other young guys that were taken from the southern kingdom on the same day that they were taken. All right, so God has really shown them incredible favor. I wrote this down, and if you're a note taker, maybe you want to write this. But Daniel and his friends, they honor God, and God honors them. And God honors them in 4 specific ways in all of this that we just studied. He honors them physically. And I know that I go through this kind of quick, so if you're note-taking and you don't get it at the end, I'll be glad to give you all these again. Daniel and his friends honored God. God honored them 4 different ways. Physically, we saw that in 14, 15, and 16, where they were robust. They were healthier than anybody else. He blessed them mentally. We see that in verse 17, and we see that in verse 20. In verse 17 and 20, they have the skills. They can learn. They know the literature. They know the wisdom. We see in verse 20, in every matter of wisdom and understanding that the king questioned them on, they were 10 times better. He blessed them, number 3, spiritually. We see that in verse 17 again. The second part of verse 17. That's where God gives Daniel spiritually, supernaturally. He's able to now interpret the dreams and the visions. Physically, mentally, spiritually, and then the 4th and final way, socially. We see that in verses 18 through 21. Out of everybody, they were the best. They went straight to work into the king's presence. Do you realize what that means? That means now they are sitting at the king's table. They are face to face with the king on a daily basis. They are with him. We see that when they come out of here, it uses the terminology here, 10 times better than the magicians, the enchanters, and all that were in the kingdom. We're going to see as we get into the next chapter that it keeps talking about the magicians and the enchanters and the fortune tellers and the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans is going to be a catch-all phrase that means the wise men of Babylon. And we're going to see those things in the next chapter. But here's the reality: because they have gone through the program that they've gone, now they are considered in that group. They're considered Chaldeans. They're considered wise men. They're considered magicians. They're considered, the enchanters. I'll say this when we get into the next chapter, but here's the reality. The king and all these ancient monarchs were very similar in this. They had these wise men that were surrounding them. And they were to interpret dreams, and they were to tell the future, and they were to do these things. We're going to see in the next chapter where they have trouble doing that for real. But the king surrounded himself with people like that could tell him basically what he wanted to hear. But there was the belief that and we see this in Scripture, if someone could tell them, hey, there's a drought coming, then the king could prepare ahead of time, and his kingdom would fare the drought better. So we do see that God does speak through dreams and visions in the Scriptures and in different ways. So that's one of the things that they're doing. But these guys who work for these ancient kings, for the most part, what they drew, where their powers that they drew from, they were none other than demonic. In fact, today, I've been told that every cultic practice that is even in practice today can be traced all the way back to Babylon. Can be traced back to this ancient time, and not only time, but this very specific place and specific time in history that we're talking about right here. When this passage says, let me look here real quick. I was going to read you a quote here. When we were talking about the test. When we were talking, I'm getting ready to draw it to a close here, and we're going to talk about King Cyrus. But I see a note here that I want to bring this up when we're talking about Daniel. When he said, "Test us for 10 days," and I said a moment ago that was them putting God to the test in a healthy, right way. Swindoll says this: in a world filled with people who rebel against the divine king, It's inevitable that believers of all ages will face situations in which their convictions will be challenged. We who are parents need to prepare our children for those occasions by both teaching them God's truth and modeling integrity. And all of us who are Christians need to personally commit ourselves to living God's way regardless of the temptations to live otherwise. This is what Daniel and his friends had been taught. This is how they would live. This is how they would live or die. What we know is that somewhere along the way in those first 15 years of life, someone had to really pour into Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. There was a whole group of young Jewish boys who were taken into exile. But these are the ones that we see standing for what they believed. Somebody along the way poured into them. And the application there is to recognize the influence that we have over children, grandchildren, friends, and family, and neighbors, and to know that we all know that all of us are faced with different decisions that we have to make at times. And just like these four guys, there's certain decisions that we can make and they're not hills to die on. There's certain decisions where we have to draw a line in the sand. And that's exactly what they did. So that's a key right there. The last thing I'll say as we close this portion out is in verse 21, it says, "And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus." Now, if you're just reading the Bible and you don't know the history that we've been talking about, you go, okay, so what? All right? The reality is, this is telling us that Daniel lives his entire life in Babylon. King Cyrus was not a Babylonian king. King Cyrus was king of the Medo-Persian Empire. Now, last week I bored you with some history, all right? And I talked about the different empires. We're going to look at that more in depth next week. But it all is going to come back together. Here's what happens. The Babylonian Empire is ruling and reigning for a period of about 70 years from the point where Daniel and his friends were taken exile. Nebuchadnezzar's not the only Babylonian king that Daniel serves under. Daniel serves under four or so, we're not exactly sure, but about four different Babylonian kings. Nebuchadnezzar, something happens to him, the next king comes up. Daniel has God's favor upon him to the point that he continues to serve. When Cyrus comes in, the Medo-Persian Empire comes and defeats the Babylonian Empire, and now the Babylonian Empire is the ruler of the world. That's why they're an empire, okay? They're not just a strong force in the world, they're an empire. They're ruling the world, all right? The Egyptians ruled the world before them, but the Babylonians defeated the Egyptians. So no longer are the Egyptians in control of the world. Now the Babylonians are. The Babylonians, after a period of 70 years, the Medo-Persian Empire comes in and defeats them. Cyrus is their king. Daniel continues to serve under a king of another country or another empire that comes and defeats the Babylonian Empire. So that again is just the sovereignty of God in a way that only God can put these things together. So Daniel is somewhere around 15 when he goes into exile. This is 70 years later. So now we know that Daniel is somewhere around the age of 85, 90 years old, still living in Babylon when the next empire comes in and takes over. That's God showing favor on him all of his life. So now, before we close, and I don't like to do this, but I'm going to. So, and what I don't like to do is read, because I'm not a very good reader. But there's two things here I want to read to you in closing this, and I want you to see these things. The first one is from a guy named Stephen Miller, and talking about Daniel staying there in Babylon for 70 years. He says Daniel lived through the entire Neo-Babylonian period, through the exile. And he continued to reign even into Cyrus's reign when the Jews were released from captivity, thus outliving his Babylonian captors. Now, tie that together with something here that John MacArthur says. And you can't write all this down, so if you want this, I can make a copy for you or something. But listen to these two paragraphs right here. Daniel served in his influential position for 70-some years. His integrity and uncompromising character had far-reaching results. For when I see, MacArthur, as he's writing this, MacArthur says, when I see the wise men coming from the east, I think of the impact of Daniel's theology and what it must have had on the Chaldean astrology. Okay? The wise men coming from the east at the birth of Jesus Christ. That's what he's tying this all the way back to. He's saying Daniel had so much influence that here we are in the 6th century, the 600 years before Christ, and his influence is going to have such impact in this country, in this region, that 600 years later when Christ comes, we're still going to see some of Daniel's influence right here. God gave him the influence that I believe led to the decree of Cyrus to send people back to their land. Influence that led to the rebuilding of the wall under Nehemiah and to the reestablishment of the nation of Israel. So we studied about Nehemiah a while back upstairs. Nehemiah was the king's cupbearer. And he was from Jerusalem. And he wanted to go back to Jerusalem because his country had laid in ruin. Remember in the history that I told you last week, Babylon goes into Jerusalem, into Israel, 3 different times. 605 BC was just the first one, and that's when Daniel and his friends were exiled. Over the next 20 years, Babylon goes back in 2 other times, and the last time that they go back into Jerusalem, they annihilate Jerusalem. They destroy the walls around Jerusalem. They destroy the temple. They leave it in ruins. They kill everybody that's there. It's a complete annihilation. All right? Here, 70 years later, Cyrus allows Nehemiah to go back and he starts to rebuild the wall. So we're seeing biblical history coming all together right here. Here's what the rest of it says right here. He says, I believe that Nehemiah had the influence that led to the rebuilding of the wall under Nehemiah and to the reestablishment of the nation of Israel. Influence that eventually led the wise men to come to crown the king who was born in Bethlehem. Daniel was behind the scenes of history of the Messiah as well as the Messiah's people. Daniel had unlimited influence through his prophecy. He brings, through the prophecy, he brings homage to the one who is King of Kings and Lord of Lords, who reigns forever and ever. So we see Daniel behind all of these things, at least his influence behind all of these things. And to me, that's just an absolutely incredible thing to start to tie all these things together and see how 600 years earlier. I've said to you guys on a number of occasions, God's not a reactionary God. God has a sovereign plan. He's not looking from heaven and going, well, okay, so they're going that way, I need to do this. That's not God. And it's still not today. So we live in a world today where we're anxious. Things seem to be crazy in a society that we live in, and prices are going up, and just weird things are happening, and it's easy to get focused on those things and get sidetracked. Listen, God's not caught off guard on any of these things. And God is sovereign. He uses chief eunuchs. He uses stewards. He uses kings. He uses evil empires. He uses people who are obedient. He uses children who are willing. His will is going to be done. That's what we're seeing in this study. That God's will is going to be done. His plan, His sovereign plan is going to be done. So let me pray for you, and we'll close this out. God, we love you. And thank you for the study that we're walking through right now. We ask that you continue to give us clarity and deep understandings. We pray, Father, that like Daniel and his friends, we will have resolve in our heart to be the people that you desire us to be in all times and in all places. Give us the strength to do that, God. Give us the wisdom to follow you and be obedient. In Jesus' name, amen.